Oh, sorry.
No.
Was the conduct of guerrilla warfare in Central America, which included the establishment of liberated zones where the guerrilla armies would predominate in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala. And in these zones, guerrilla armies would set up the embryonic form of the revolutionary society they wanted to establish. Right? That's where they would set up the kind of health, education, social welfare programs that they wanted to display to the world would be the way that they would reorganize society after the victory of the revolution. And so I arrived in Colombia in 1989, which, as Queen Elizabeth would call it, an annus horribilis, right? A horrible year in which there was martial law, 3 presidential candidates were assassinated, the Medellin Mafia and the Cali Mafia were conducting warfare against each other. Pablo Escobar shot a commercial aircraft out of the sky, and so on. Terrible, terrible things happened. And I was very confused about the FARC, the largest guerrilla group in Colombia. So I'm going to start with an excerpt from the paper that Felix, Manuel, and I have co-authored, which sets the scene for what our discussion is going to be today in the context of asking the question, what was the FARC? On November 7th, 1998, the Colombian Army and Police began a withdrawal from a zone larger than Switzerland, approximately 42,000 square kilometers, or 16,000 square miles, consisting of the municipios of Vista Hermosa, La Macarena, La Uribe, and Mesetas in the Departamento of Meta, and San Vicente de Caguan in the Departamento de Caquetá. In doing so, this area came under full control of Colombia's largest and oldest guerrilla army, Las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias Colombianas, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, heretofore referred to as the FARC. The withdrawal was complete on February 17, 1999, and was carried out, according to the Colombian government, to facilitate peace negotiations with the FARC. And here you see, in the corner here, a full map of Colombia, and then those are the 5 municipios, the municipalities of the zone. The FARC's Zona de Despeje, or Zona de Destensión de San Vicente de Caguan, variously translated in English as the clearance zone, disengagement zone, or demilitarized zone, and heretofore referred to as the ZDD, existed until February 20th, 2002. So that was 3 years. On that date, the Colombian army reoccupied the entire zone following the failure of peace negotiations and repeated violations of a ceasefire by both the army and the FARC, in the latter case including high-profile kidnappings and urban bombings. During those years, my former Colombian student and now colleague and friend Felix Manuel Burgos lived and worked as an elementary school teacher in the ZDD, more precisely in the Vereda Caño Indio in the municipio of La Macarena, while he was an undergraduate student. As a sociocultural anthropologist, I was a member of Dr. Burgos's PhD committee in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at UNM, where he successfully defended his dissertation in mid-2013. This article stems from the discussions we have had about his life in and observations of the ZDD, conversations which took place during the time he studied here at UNM, and which prompted me to get back in touch with him many years after and to start talking about his memories. He told me that while he had often wanted to record these memories, he had never done so. And in the process of doing so, Felix Manuel began to unpack the emotional trauma that had previously discouraged him from writing down his memories. We decided to co-author an article based on the interchange between us, which hinged in part on Felix Manuel writing short essays or cuentos, stories, about his life in the ZDD, as well as innumerable phone conversations and email exchanges. I was eager to explore why I had maintained a complicated fascination with the ZDD through the years, which was made possible through the resonances and differences between our analyses of the ZDD. So now I'm going to hand this over to Felix Manuel, who's going to talk about how he came to live there and what that intersection came from.
All right. So first, thank you very much for coming, and I'm very happy to be here at the LAII. For me, it's a place that I have great memories. I did my master's here. I used to work in that little casino over there for 2 years. Actually, my first job was in this library to arrange all these books. It's really nice. So, let's say I'm from Colombia, I'm from Bogota, and I was studying at that time at Universidad Nacional, which is the best university of Colombia. I'm sorry with the people from Los Andes here.
Sorry.
It is the largest public university. And one of the things that you feel when you're in this university is the political climate. Everyone's involved in politics, leftist politics of the whole spectrum. You have from Maoists, from Ejército de Liberación, from some people more related to the FARC, but you have the whole spectrum. Okay? As you can see, the protests in this movement started in the 50s. This is the first massacre in a protest where they killed 13 students or 17 students. And one of them was a leader, Ariel Gutierrez, I think. And then by his death, they created the Day of the Student. And every year, there's a protest for the day. And almost every year another student died and become a cycle protest. So you see this carry on through the 70s, where we have leftist protests all over the world. It obviously happened also in Latin America, especially Mexico. Colombia was not an exception. And then we have the 90s, where the climate was, let's mention, we have on one side what was happening with the cartel, and on the other side, the abandonment of Las FARC. Las FARC ended up being a guerrilla group, and it starts being seen as an army because they are occupying territories, even a capital, Me Too. So the perception of the FARC changed from what it was a guerrilla in the mountains that was just running away from the army, and it was on the offensive. Okay. So what we saw was we already had this romantic idea of the guerrilla, but at this point, it was seen as they actually have the capacity to take the power. So we were motivated as students to support the FARC way and help them to get to this peace negotiation that no one knew where it was going to go. They were going to end up in a political negotiation, or if actually the FARC was using this time just to get power and get to finally to the conquest of national power. Yeah. So when it started, La Zona Este, we were very excited, and there was this NGO from Netherlands who offered us tickets to travel over there to be teachers, voluntary teachers. So the agreement was that the NGO will give us the transportation, plane tickets, and some of the boats, and the communities will provide food and shelter for us. We were public students; we didn't have any money. So we passed the process. It wasn't that difficult. It was just they wanted to see that you committed, that you can stay 6 months. That was the minimum that you can stay. No one knew how long the Zona Este were going to last. The idea was to stay during the whole process. So that's how we ended up in the Zona Este. We were in different. This is La Macarena, and you cannot see it here, but topographically, La Macarena is a serranía. Independent mountains that is independent from Los Andes. It emerged before Los Andes, very old, archaeologically defined this point, thousands, 100 million. And then each of us, we were 17 students, went to a different municipality. All of them, the other students, they stayed with families. But I decided to stay in the school, because it was the most remote village. I actually have just 2 families, kids from 2 families. Okay. So it was very small. I can show you later. So yeah, that was the situation. I was the only person, the only adult in this school. I had a beginning with 8 and ended up with 6 students. A smaller, 6 years old, and the other 12.
So I'm going to now give a little historical background about the origins of the FARC that contextualize the ZDD and also respond to the title of our presentation, What Was the FARC? The social, political, and economic conditions extant in the area where the ZDD existed for 3 years are contextualized by the massive displacement of peasant or campesino communities, which occurred as a central consequence of the period in the mid-20th century of Colombian history called La Violencia, the violence, as well as by the persistence and importance of this area in the history of the FARC. Beginning in 1948, with the assassination of radical liberal presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, and lasting over a decade, La Violencia was, in the view of Colombian historians, a sustained war against rural Colombian farmers by the political establishment and its elites. As described by scholar Clemencia Ramirez, refugee campesinos fleeing local atrocities during La Violencia and the massive displacement of campesino communities which occurred as a central consequence organized mobile self-defense groups. These comités de autodefensa enabled the coalescence of new communities of peasant colonists, campesinos colonos, which conservative Senator Álvaro Gómez Hurtado and the Colombian press bombastically referred to as repúblicas independientes, or independent republics. And it's actually the focus of Felix Manuel's dissertation is how the Colombian media uses rhetoric to create public opinion about violence, about the guerrillas, about paramilitaries. So this is a long tradition in the Colombian media, very sophisticated media, a media that's very, very controlled by and manipulated by the political establishment. So this term, repúblicas independientes, generated a fury in Colombia about separatism, about the idea that anybody would try to separate any part of Colombia from La República, right? And so this was very instrumental in generating a kind of public opinion that reacted to the fact that these peasant communities, these campesino communities, had formed to defend themselves against atrocities. In remote interior regions, oh yeah, we have that up right there. Thank you. Remote interior regions, excuse me, at the frontiers between the departments of Tolima, Huila, Caquetá, Meta, and Cauca, the communities formed. The Colombian Communist Party had been active in these areas, and communists and radicalized liberal party activists helped to organize the autodefensa groups to protect campesinos from the war that was being waged against them. These new communities have been characterized as armed colonization, and were depicted in a diary by one of the founders of the FARC, Jacobo Arenas, El Diario de la Resistencia in Marquetalia. And Marquetalia was one of the independientes, Republicas Independientes. Yeah. Well, it should be there. It should be there. It's just that it's covered by that transcription thing.
Yeah, there you go.
If you go up, if it's when it says screen sharing, it's underneath that. Anyway, it's this. It's the red. It's the red. So these were communities where refugees, campesino refugees, and also colonos, right? People who were colonizing areas of the country that really there was very little population, were organizing villages that had themselves a revolutionary sort of intention. And so these were, in a sense, the components of a utopian experiment, right, in the interior of Colombia. The Repúblicas Independientes were targeted by the national government starting in 1962, with massive armed incursions continuing until 1965, when the last such area was finally overrun by the Colombian armed forces, who were being supported by the United States and, interestingly, by the Green Beret, before their deployment in Vietnam. And interestingly, also with respect to the Vietnam War, with widespread use of napalm, which of course gained infamy during the Vietnam War. In 1964, the FARC was organized by the survivors of this campaign. So in other words, the utopian communities died, were destroyed, and then the FARC was founded by communist activists, radical liberals, and displaced campesinos colombianos, the survivors of the war against the Repúblicas Independientes. In other words, the FARC was created in the aftermath of the complete destruction of communal social experiments that were conceived as utopian or liberated zones for what the campesino colonos and their communist and liberal allies envisioned as a revolutionary way to organize Colombian society. Based upon the work of Colombian historians and social scientists, I believe these communities are populations of displaced, impoverished peasants engaged in the settlement of remote regions as armed groups have been FARC's constituency from the very beginning. In that way, as ironic as it may seem, the FARC's peasant revolutionary guerrillas were also the inheritors of the long arc of the conquest of the Americas. Right? Let's get that picture of Marulanda. So the man in the uniform is Manuel Marulanda Vélez, who was one of the founding members of the FARC. Over the many decades of armed struggle, FARC has exhibited what FARC leader Manuel Marulanda Vélez called absolute and total mobility and a geographic dispersion in numerously multiple frentes or fronts across Colombian territory. Rather than setting up its own parallel revolutionary state in such areas, the FARC has used the existing state institutions and frameworks of laws, even in areas where the FARC exercise ultimate authority. Such tactics derive from the inception and the ruins of the Repúblicas Independientes. And the significance of these strategies, with their deep roots in FARC's early history, is marked with respect to what took place in the ZDD, which was actually located in a frontier region that overlapped with several of the independent republics in the late 1950s, and 1960s. So if we look at the map,
Colombia.
let's look at the ZDD map. Yeah. These for specific Repúblicas Independientes, which is Guayabero and El Pato, these areas correspond to or overlap with the municipio de San Vicente de Caguán, which was one of the 5 municipios of the ZDD. So I'm going to hand that now to Felix Manuel.
Yes, to complement that, in the history of the FARC, we have this first movement, truly peasant. Then comes a second generation that is a more intellectual part, citizen, students, mostly from the Communist Party, that get to these peasants. So they give them a more political action. The other was more organic, without any that organization that the political bring. And there's this third generation, which is more, they call it los guerreros, the warriors. They're not as political as the other generation, but they show their strength in military strength. So the communities saw them to Tiro Fijo, for example, he's historical because he's part of the founders. Then Raúl Reyes, he will be part of the politicians. He was educated in the Soviet Union. And there is El Mono Cojoy, which is as an example of the guerreros. Thing is that in this moment is when the FARC, they're not drug dealers, but what they say is that they charge taxes on everything. So if they go to a region with their soil, they will charge oil. If they go to a region where pineapple is planted, they will charge pineapple. And if it's coke, they will charge coke. So they claim not to be part of the narcotics. It simply exists where the where the coca is produced. But definitely there's money of coca into the FARC. And that generation is connected with that third.
What years are you talking about right now?
And
What range of years are you talking about?
in 88 to 90s.
Maybe mid-90s.
Mid-90s. That's the third generation. So yes. So what I want to do now is to show a little bit of what it was La Zona de Despeje, of what we saw, the expectations. In La Zona de Despeje, you have different frentes. So the frentes are the basic unit of the guerrilla. They dominate specific regions. You see the difference of frentes in terms of guns, uniform, even how well fed are the guerrillas, and that is connected with the presence of coca or not. If there's coca, you will see good guns, if you see good uniforms. So within the FARC, there's this like federal division where each frente provides for himself. There's not a centralized finances where the secretary collects money, distributes equally. No, each one has its own capacity. So it was clear who had more money in terms of frentes, and it depends what region or the. You can see here, this is of the rich, but by the uniform, you see how they look, the presence, the boinas, well organized, and there were other guerrilleros who were like that. This is an exchange of prisoners that is taking place, thanks to the Zona de Despeje. One of the first things that happened was that the government released 450 something guerrilleros, and the same thing did La FARC, because the La FARC, as I told you, was on the offensive and was making prisoners of war. All the ranks, they even had generals, but most of them were regular soldiers, as these ones, who they are liberated at that moment. So now this is the contrast of the civilians in La Zona de Despeje with the FARC. The FARC has always had a presence, but it was an intermittent presence. Like you can see them at night, you know that they're there. There's rumors he belongs to that, but finally the guerrilla is there in the town, control, with power, deciding everything. So this is like the first clash that civilians and guerrilla have, the opportunity to interact openly. And I think that this picture represents very well. It's defining. It is, come and see. Guerrillero. And you can see peasants. When you talk to them, they're peasants with uniform and guns. It's not the fault. And this is another example. And I like this picture because it shows the contrast of what I lived. That it was this world of education, kids, and it is so naive, with the war happening outside, and the fear, the guns, the bombs. And I think that the picture is not mine. This is from El Tiempo. Showed it well. So in my case, I didn't have the presence of that part that much because we were in a remote. I was in a very remote village. So they didn't go that often. They were called 2 times to my school for complaints of the campesinos, the peasants, about me. The first complaint was that I was teaching art. So they didn't like that the kids were full of mud, pain when they come back home. So they called the comandante and told him he came here to teach him how to act, how to strike, how to read, but they're just come covered with mud. What kind of issue is this? And then I remember defending myself, saying, well, as the commandante knows, we have 2 hemispheres. And once you play with clay, the 2 hands connect, and then the hemispheres that. And mother said, "Oh, he's right." Very important for the brain. I knew it. So that was one. And the second one, it was very serious because it was a complaint. What happened is that I asked kids to draw examples of revolutions. We were in biology, so we were seeing the different reinos, reino animal, reino plantas, kingdoms. So I had asked them to draw reproduction, so one draw birds and other plants, but the oldest of the kids, the 12, had a couple having sex. And he showed me this. But when I saw it, it's reproduction too. I just check, fine, good. So when he went back and his mom saw that, he assumed that I was asking them to draw people having sex. And this is very, very serious with the FARC, of course. How can a teacher do this? So they came immediately. I mean, that you are asking kids to show people having sex, and I showed them the other draws. Yes, this is what we did with the others. This is a pajarito, this is a plant, and as you can see here, the homework was just reproduction. It came with that, but it wasn't there. Yeah, settled down things, but it was tense. That when they came, asking how it is that you are asking them to draw pictures. So there were the 2 times. And now we're gonna read one cuento that has to do with this environment in Caño Indio. Okay. So I'm gonna read it in Spanish, paragraph in Spanish. Let's gonna read paragraph in English. He will say.
So this is one of the cuentos, right, about Felix Manuel's life in the ZDD.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called in Spanish El Venado, or the deer.
Okay. El venado. Los niños de la familia Albán llegaron sonriendo esa mañana. Su sonrisa no era la misma de todos los días. Había algo de picardía en ellas. Los 2 niños menores, Pedrito y Snyder, se me acercaron y con la seguridad de los pequeños que crecen en el monte, preguntaron, profe, ¿usted quiere comer carne?
The children of the Alban family arrived at school smiling that morning. Their smile was not the same one I had seen every other day. There was something mischievous about it. The 2 younger children, Pedrito and Snyder, approached me, and with the confidence of little ones who grow up in the wilderness, they said, "Teacher, do you want to eat some meat?"
So you have an idea.
That's him.
Yeah, that point. So, en medio de la selva era una oferta tentadora. La comida regular era yuca, queso y arroz, y con suerte, algún pescado que lograba sacar del río que pasaba junto a la escuela. Pese a que había mucho ganado en la zona, la carne era un lujo exquisito. Los ganaderos tenían bien contadas sus reses y cualquier ausencia tendría que ser pagada por la comunidad.
Living in the middle of the jungle, that was a tempting offer. The regular food I ate was yuca, cheese, and rice, and with some luck, fish that I would sometimes catch from the river that passed by the school. Although there were many cattle in the area, meat was the ultimate luxury. The ranchers carefully counted their cattle to the last one, and even one missing cow would have to be paid for by the community.
La extraña oferta y la hambre acumulada me llevaron a sentir con entusiasmo. Entonces venga eso de las 6 a la casa, se va a chupar los dedos, concluyó Snyder. El día pasó sin más mención del prometido banquete. Como de costumbre, di mis distintas clases al grupo de 6 niños que tenía en mi escuela, que correspondían a dos familias distintas, los Albán y los Gutiérrez.
This extraordinary offer and my pent-up hunger prompted me to nod enthusiastically. So come to our house around 6 o'clock. It's going to be finger-licking good, tempted Snyder. The day passed without further mention of the promised feast. As usual, I gave my different classes to the group of 6 children that I taught in the school. They belonged to 2 different families, the Albans and the Gutierrezes.
So this was the school. This was my room. Sí. So, después de la jornada, los estudiantes regresaron a sus casas. Me quedé leyendo toda la tarde, distraído con la pregunta de cómo una familia tan pobre como los Albán habrían logrado conseguir carne. Tomé mi camino pasada las 5 y después de caminar por un sendero cubierto por enormes ceibas, llegué a la casa de los Albán. Se encontraba en un punto alto, desde donde se veía el verde infinito de la Sierra de la Macarena y al fondo, como un delgado hilo gris, el río Guayabero.
After the school day ended, the students returned to their homes. I was left to read all afternoon, distracted by the question of how a family as poor as the Albans would have managed to get some meat. I started walking after 5 p.m., and after walking along a path sheltered by enormous ceiba trees, I arrived at the Albans' house. It was located on a high spot where the infinite green of the Sierra de la Macarena forests could be seen, and in the background, like a thin gray thread, the Guayabero River.
Mientras me acercaba a la casa de madera y latas, un extraño sonido me sobrecogió. Era un gemido lastimero e intermitente. La intensidad del raro lamento se clarificó cuando entré al pequeño patio central. En medio del barro y amarrado a una estaca había un pequeño venado. Su color era castaño claro, con 2 líneas blancas en sus tremendos ojos asustados. Esa era la prometida carne. Se movía con desesperación, intentando escapar de la cuerda que rodeaba su cuello. Saltaba, se retorcía y sobre todo gemía. Su triste condición contrastaba con la sonrisa de niños y adultos. Todos me miraban buscando en mí alguna feliz reacción por el hecho de tener un banquete enfrente. Sin embargo, vieron en mí cara de desconcierto y rabia.
As I approached the house made of wood planks and sheet metal, a strange sound assaulted me. It was a pitiful, intermittent moan. The source of this intensely odd wailing was made clear as I entered the small household's central courtyard. In the middle of this muddy yard, tied to a stake, was a small deer. His fur was brown, and there were 2 white lines in his huge, frightened eyes. He was the promised meat. He moved desperately, trying to escape the rope around his neck. He jumped, writhed, and above all, moaned. His sad condition contrasted with the smiles of the children and the adults. Everyone looked at me, expecting me to react with joy at the sight of the feast to come, right in front of me. However, instead, they saw my expression of bewilderment and anger.
Parte de nuestra misión como voluntarios era proteger las especies de la zona. Así que les dije, con paternal recriminación, que debían dejarlo libre. Mi argumento era que se trataba de un venado muy joven y la caza debía limitarse a los grandes. No, profe, ¿cómo vamos a dejarlo ir? Acá tenemos carne para toda la semana. Seguí insistiendo hasta que llegué a mi último recurso argumentativo. Según los letreros de las FARC, no se debía cazar ni pescar animales pequeños. Así que con voz solemne amenacé. Si no lo sueltan, le voy a comentar al comandante de la zona.
Because part of our mission as volunteers was to protect the animal species in the area. So I told them reproachfully that they should let the deer go. My argument was that it was a very young deer and hunting should be limited only to adults. No, teacher, how are we going to let him go? He will provide meat for the whole week. I kept insisting, however, until I reached for my ultimate persuasive argument. According to the regulations set by the FARC, small animals should not be hunted or fished. So, in a solemn voice, I threatened, if you don't release him, I am going to tell the commander of the area.
Una carcajada colectiva estalló en mi cara. Profe, si usted le cuenta, ahí sí que no va a haber comida para nadie, porque ese comandante se lo va a comer solo. Ese fue uno de los pequeños ejemplos que me dio a entender la relación con la ley y la autoridad de la Macarena. Ellos sabían que, pese a que las reglas estaban escritas, los encargados de cumplirlas velaban por sus propios intereses. En este caso, el esencial sentido del estómago.
Collective laughter broke out right in front of my face. Professor, if you tell the commander, then there will be no food for anyone because he will eat it up all by himself. At that moment, as in other instances, I understood the relationship between defining law and authority in La Macarena. People knew that despite the fact that the rules had been written down, those in charge of enforcing them would look after their own interests. In this case, the essential need to fill one's stomach.
Al ver que mi amenaza no tenía ningún efecto, pasé a otra más personal. Si ustedes le hacen algo a ese venado, me voy de la vereda y los niños se quedan sin clases. Papás y niños se miraron sin mucha sorpresa. Hubo un pequeño silencio, hasta que Snyder dijo, no sea así, profe, va a ver que le va a gustar, es una deliciosura. Le respondí que nunca apoyaría eso y que me iba de regreso a la escuela. Pero en el fondo, ellos y yo sabíamos que no iba a llegar lejos. Estaba por caer la noche y regresar a oscuras era garantía de quedar perdido en medio de la selva. Así que me alejé a una colina cercana. Desde allí veía la casa y pensé en lo inútil de mi poder para disuadir la forma de vida a la que los campesinos estaban acostumbrados. Mis razones ecológicas de un jovencito de ciudad no funcionarían para contrarrestar la básica subsistencia de quienes han crecido en medio del monte. En esas reflexiones andaba cuando los gemidos del venado se empezaron a apagar. No podré olvidar el sonido gutural de ahogo. Podía ver cómo don Pedro, haciendo girar un palo, empezó a apretar la cuerda que el venado tenía en su cuello y con cada nuevo giro salía del venado sus últimas exhalaciones. Mordiendo los dientes de la rabia, pensé en irme. Solo deseaba dejar de ver ese triste espectáculo y regresar a la escuela a comer algo de yuca y queso, pues tenía mi estómago vacío, pues solo tenía en mi estómago el frío desayuno de ese día.
Seeing that my threat had no effect on anyone, I decided to take on a more personal tactic. If you do anything to that deer, I said, I'll leave the village and the children will be without classes. Parents and children looked at each other. They were not surprised, and after a short period of silence, a Snyder told me, don't be like that, teacher. You will see. You will like it. It is delicious. I replied that I could never agree to that, and that I was going back to the school where I also lived. But deep down, all of us knew I wasn't going to get too far. Night was about to fall, and trying to return on foot in the dark guaranteed getting lost in the middle of the jungle. So I walked away to a nearby hill. From there, I could see the house, and I thought how useless it was to dissuade the peasants from following the way of life to which they were accustomed. My ecologically oriented reasons were those of an idealistic young man from the city. They could not do anything to counteract the basic subsistence needs and ways of those who have grown up in the middle of the wilderness. I was walking deep in my reflections when the moans of the deer began to subside. I'll never be able to forget the guttural choking sound I heard next. From where I was, I could see how Don Pedro, using a stick to tighten the rope that had the deer around its neck, and with each new turn, the deer took its last breaths. Clenching my teeth in rage, I thought about leaving the area. I thought to myself, stop watching this sad spectacle, and go back to school to eat some yuca and cheese. I had only eaten breakfast that day because of the promise of the feast.
Pasados unos minutos, me levanté de mi mirador y decidí emprender el camino. Tenía que dejar una lección a los salvajes, mantenerme firme en mis principios y salir con la frente en alto. Sin embargo, un olor me paralizó. El humo que olía hace un rato ya no era solo de madera. Ahora se mezclaba con los tonos inconfundibles del asado. El olor se avivaba y cada nueva aspiración me hacía salivar sin pausa. A lo lejos vi el movimiento de pequeños comensales alrededor del fuego. Con algo de curiosidad y mucho de hambre, bajé de nuevo a la casa. Ha sido la carne más exquisita que he comido en mi vida.
After a few minutes, I got up from where I had been watching and decided to start walking. I had to teach the Albans a lesson. I would stick to my principles and go out with my head held high. However, the wafting aroma paralyzed me. Very soon, the smell of smoke no longer was just of wood burning. Now it was mixed with the unmistakable tones of the roasting meat. The aroma intensified, and each new inhalation made me salivate continuously. From where I stood, I saw the movement of small diners congregating around the fire. With curiosity and a great deal of hunger, I went down back to the house. That was the most delicious meat I have ever eaten in my life.
And that's an example of the three that we have in this article. This is one of the short tales. There's another two. And the idea is that each of them shows an aspect of what it was to live there. This is more the idea of the ecological relationship that we have. And
So we have some information about the FARC's rules around environment and ecology, and the sort of disagreements in the Colombian scholarly community about this. We have a lot of information about the population that lived in the zone, in the ZDD during this time, and how they made their living. I think that the descriptions show a kind of symbiotic relationship that existed between the campesino communities and the FARC during this period of time. But this was no revolutionary society. Right? This was not a liberated zone. This was not a zone that was set up to try to show the world. This is what the FARC would do if they were able to control the entire country. One of the other cuentos that Felix Manuel wrote is about the economics of the zone. The Colombian government prevented cash efectivo, right, from flowing into the zone, which limited the kind of trade that could take place. And what occurred instead was that money became coca paste, right? Or coca paste became money, and that's one of the other cuentos that's told in El Día en que la coca when se volvió a moneda, right? The day that coca became money. And so that's another really interesting story. And that actually was the first story that Felix Manuel ever told me that kind of hooked me on, we've got to do this someday. We've got to tell these stories because I was so fascinated. You were about to say something.
Exactly that. That the others talk about the economics. And then the last one is more about the war, because it narrates the end of the zona del despegue and how we were able to know before the media said, even the president said, that it was over, because we overheard the helicopters, and we never have heard that before. So we knew they're coming in. The rumors about paramilitaries coming from the Rio or two, so we knew before officially what occurred. It was a kidnap of a senator, actually, what brought the decision of Pastrana to end up zona despegue. It was too much pressure for him to continue that.
So it was in fact a zone where the FARC would stash kidnapped victims, where the FARC would store its arms and conduct training, and where they would tax the production of coca paste from coca. They also built a road network to transport finished cocaine to ports on the Pacific side. So again, far from being a liberated zone, it was what I would call an anti-utopian zone. And that's part of what we did in the article, is to explore the idea of anti-utopia, which is not the same as dystopia in the sense of a place where all of the terrible things of society are exacerbated, like racism or sexism or pandemic, for example, but rather a zone where the ideals of utopia are themselves discarded. And a kind of other sort of resistance takes place that characterized the FARC and the kind of war that it conducted. So maybe we should start taking questions now, on the basis of what we've already given, with people here and then the people that are in the Zoom audience.
One question that comes to mind is seeing young children as soldiers. Did you encounter families that told you stories of how they had to relinquish their kids to the guerrillas in terms of, or did you see something like that?
No, there was no forced recruitment in the area because they didn't need to. The people were so excited about the FARC, that they didn't need to force them to join. What they used to do is they were more subtle in this sense. For example, they would send beautiful guerrillas to the town, and they would go to the bars. They start talking to the guys, start drinking, having fun, and they told them about this wonderful world of what the FARC is. A brotherhood, everyone does the same. There's no hierarchies. You will be provided with food. Look at the guns that we have. And they voluntarily signed in. So the FARC didn't have to force anyone to join them. They have plenty of volunteers, many women.
And the age that they did study recruiting work?
I never see kids, but they were young. I mean, I assume 16, 17, but I never saw younger than that. What I remember is guerrillas, when they were pregnant, they were allowed to have the kids with them for 2 years, so they can go back to the civilian life for 2 years to stay with the baby, and then come back to the guerrilla and let the baby with their family. So that was the only thing that I remember related with kids, the sons of the guerrillas.
I think it's also important to see that the population was very much divided between the descendants of two different groups of colonos. So the earlier group that starts in the 30s, it are the people that become the cattle ranchers, the ganaderos. And they, at least according to the literature that I have read, were not sympathetic to the FARC at any point. The second group that comes in the 80s of colonos are the people affiliated with the growing of coca. And they have always been a constituency of the FARC, particularly in this region, particularly in Caquetá, the Departamento de Caquetá and Neta, and other regions of the southwest of Colombia. And so these are populations of people who are moving from desperate situations, right? With very little land, very little opportunity, very little access to any kind of social service. And they're moving as colonists, to plant coca in regions where they're not originally from. Their families are not from there. And they are FARC's constituency. Over and over again, I think I see this in the literature. And they were in the ZPD as well. And they were probably the majority. But it seems like the relationship between the ganaderos might have been a little bit more hostile. And maybe they were not recruited as easily, or maybe not at all, right, to the FARC.
And the ganaderos were the owners of the land, or the previous owners?
Well, they owned ranches, right? And then the second wave of colonos would have colonized land that were not, right? Baldío, right? Common property. They would have just squatted on that and cleared it and planted coca.
Yeah. Did the FARC have an urban guerrilla strategy, or was it essentially confined to these rural districts? And as an allied question, I'm just curious about your opinion of the revolutionary strategy and tactics of the FARC, since they apparently operated in these different frentes without a unified central structure. Do you think that was a tactically, strategically a good course of action? And also, did they have an urban presence?
Yeah, there had been discussions about that strategy because that the FLN had a more intellectual base, urban base. The other example is the M19, that it was mainly urban, whereas the FARC has been always peasants. So the strategy was first to conquest territory, have loyal people that they can move freely, and then encircle the main cities in order to throw the final attack. But in that final attack, they also need to have bases. So they were urban commandos, mainly made by students. For example, in the Universidad Nacional, there were parades of La FARC, and they were shown. They show this armament that they have in the city, and that was a sign of the strength that they were able to put in the center of Bogotá 15 guerrilleros with all well armed, and they show that to the students in a way to show the society we're here. And you can see the graffitis over there, but they were not that present in the periphery of the cities as, for example, the LN that tried to be that, or the M19, that it was simultaneous action in the countryside and in the city. FARC was more in countryside with nucleus, clandestine nucleus in the city.
And if you talk about a constituency, right, I think FARC's constituency is displaced peasant colonists. That's like the people whose interests that they represent, even though they are ostensibly a communist organization, which of course is linked to a Marxist idea about the proletariat as a revolutionary subject. I think that the FARC, in the history that we recount in the article, consistently the constituency that it represents is these. What that really starts with the violencia, right? Displaced campesinos who are moving into new zones as colonos, and who by the late 1970s and 1980s are primarily subsisting through the cultivation of coca. And they might have an urban cell, right? Like Felix Manuel was saying, but they're as a social sector, that's the constituency they represent.
Did the FARC have some relationship with Communist Party in Cuba at all, or what was the attitude of Fidel Castro and Guevara and others toward FARC and its approach and its strategy?
Cuban revolution was more connected with the LN, definitely. So the strengths. But I think that what I read, the final book of Fidel Castro was actually devoted to Colombia. And the reasoning about why the revolution didn't succeed in Colombia. So Fidel always showed interest in the revolutionary movement in Colombia. And he talked about the strategy of capturing, remember that he criticized the strategy of the moment of capturing the soldiers like this. He was saying that from the military perspective, it didn't make sense to carry as a guerrilla organization a large number of prisoners, and that if they show that they can keep them for months or even for years, what will happen in the next combat is the soldiers will die fighting before being captured. So the reasoning that he was making is that if you liberate them after 3-4 days, after giving them a talk, but you are in the next combats, what is going to happen is that the soldiers are going to give their guns. They know that will save their life. They're going to be home in 4 days. So he was criticizing that method from the military perspective in the tactic. But I don't know ideologically how Fidel saw the FARC.
Well, certainly the negotiations took place in Havana, right? That led to the 2016 peace treaty. So on that level alone, there's some kind of relationship between the FARC, at least trusting that that could be productive for them to conduct those negotiations. Yeah.
Can you comment a little bit on the peace agreement and how it has held, what the strengths and weaknesses are, and how it's held and where, in areas, in subject areas as well as geographically, some of the difficulties of the implementation?
So I'll start. It's clear that the peace treaty was a demobilization, right? There were many aspects of the peace treaty that their implementation has been extremely spotty. What the peace treaty has done is demobilized about 75% or 80% of the FARC, right? The remaining 20 or 25% has had, a variety of different fates. When people said that before the treaty or at its greatest strength, the FARC was 15,000 people or more, maybe 20,000. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
20,000, right?
But 20,000 people.
Right. But these are men and women in arms, in uniforms.
Right.
So not including sympathizers or people who live, but actual soldiers. So if there's 80% of that, right, that's maybe 80% of 20,000 is about 1,600, maybe 2,000 people. Some of them have joined criminal organizations. Some of them have joined the ELN. And some of them are recasting themselves as a reborn FARC. The peace treaty had 6 different elements, one of which was demobilization. That has been the most successful. And reintegration. And reintegration has been much spottier, right? Because the government did not provide the resources to facilitate that, to create training programs, to give the former soldiers a means to make income and so on. So that's been much spottier. And then from there on out, it's even worse. I mean, and I think this is one of the things I was listening to the new president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, his address at the United Nations the other day, and he was talking about just embracing the fact that the drug war is a failure, right? And what to do in order to create a much more effective or a totally different approach, right? And of course, I think that approach would include legalization of cocaine, both in the United States and Europe and here and there in Colombia. But in any event, the part of the peace treaty that was about ending the drug trade has been a total failure. I think from the perspective of the things that we talk about in this paper, the more interesting uh, uh, element of the peace treaty that's also a failure is land reform. So an effort to create a system that's far more egalitarian, that in effect ends the long war of the political elites against the campesinos, which is what the la violencia means, right? And so there's this idea of creating zonas de reserva campesina, um, farmer common zones where farmers can develop agriculture with their communities in a way that is not controlled by the large corporations that control industrial capitalist agriculture in Colombia. Interestingly, one of the largest zonas de reserva campesina is also contiguous with the Repúblicas Independientes and the Zona de Extensión. It's in that same place. That's the largest ZRC, Zona de Reserva Campesina. That has had some movement forward, but it is very spotty, and the Colombian political economic elite is very much opposed to these zones.
I think there's been specialized courts too, land courts.
Yeah, that's also been an area that's supposed to be affiliated with the land reform. So the implementation of the accords has been really divergent around the 6 different areas around that are part of the peace treaty.
Do you have any questions? Zoom that you want?
We lost connection with the Zoom, so.
Okay.
Thank you for coming.
It was very, very interesting. Yeah.
You should take it.
Well, we're going to submit it as soon as we have our map, right?
But no pressure.
And so we want to put together a map that combines. So we would have a map that would show the larger map of Colombia, and then the Repúblicas Independientes, the Zona de Despeje, and the Zona de Reserva Campesina. And here is that's the Zona de Reserva Campesina that also overlaps with the historic Repúblicas Independientes and the Zona de Despeje. Because, as remote as this place is, here are the 3 cordilleras of Colombia. This is right smack in the middle of the Cordillera Oriental, which is rugged terrain, right? And just really also kind of an amazing ecological environmental zone. It keeps on being that place, right? In the history of the FARC and in the history of the campesino movement in Colombia. It's really amazing. So we're going to have a map that overlaps.
Do you have a name? Have you settled on its title yet, or is that still?
Well, this is the title right now: Colombian Utopia and Anti-Utopia, Remembering and Reconsidering the FARC's Zona de Despeje, 1998 to 2002. And we're going to submit it to the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology. And we hope that they'll like it and publish it. Other questions, comments?
What has happened to the area de Spain in terms of the situation?
One of the main attractions of the area that no one used to go before because of the president of La FARC is Caño Cristales. Caño Cristales is a river, 7 colors. It's beautiful, beautiful.
It's one of the world-renowned tourist sites in Colombia.
In my school, when I went back to La Macarena, the municipality, I have to pass across. So it was 5 hours walking, and I always have to cross. It's a river magical because it's in stone. It's water that has been running for millions of years through this stone, so it doesn't have any sediments. It's just the water moving around. So it's like a big sculpture of a river in algae, and that's what they give them the color. So some of the projects that the guerrillas did was to create ecotourism in that area. And they're very good at that because they know the area very well. And the ex-guerrillas. So they're moving toward that kind of production initiatives. Agriculture it hasn't gone that well because the same problem that the peasants had before, they don't have mediums to take out their production outside. So they're trying, some of them initiated a program of botas foods because they're really good at food, they know a lot. You try them with the fire foods, they're a good move.
Really? Can we buy them here in the US?
No, but in Colombia you
You can buy pork foods.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found in my research is that the people who live in the 5 municipios have been stigmatized. They've been considered by people outside and by the police and the army because by the very fact that they live there, they must have been collaborators with the FARC. And so there's been a really long, this is now 2002, the Zona de Espejo was reconquered by the Colombian army. Every so often, El Tiempo or other mainstream media will send reporters down there and find that people say, yeah, we're still treated like we're some kind of like traitors to the Colombian state because we happen to live in these municipalities through no choice of our own and we survived. And so therefore we are considered to have been collaborators with the FARC. So that seems to be a long-term issue. And the Colombian state, which is never particularly good at investing in rural areas, right? That's not one of their strong points. Still to this day, we'll see what Petro's able to do. In particular, in these 5 municipalities, has not really been very responsive to the needs of those communities. Again, under the suspicion, like, well, they all collaborated with the FARC. So there's definitely been a stigma for people from La Macarena, from Caguan, Mercedes, and all these places. What a delightful audience you all there. It's so really great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Did you incorporate all of these stories into your article as well?
Yeah, it's gonna be a different article. It's not gonna be
Yeah.
typical article. It's gonna have some of this creative writing, experimenting, because I like literature, but I never have myself done as a writer in that sense. And this can go back to my memories and try to put it in a way that is also realistic, but at the same time, just to read, that you will enjoy it, read it. So a different type of articles.
Supposedly anthropologists are opening up their minds to other sorts of texts and other sorts of ways of telling about these experiences. And we'll see whether they are. We'll see. Thanks, everybody.
I love seeing